what is your definition of a principle? And we'll start with Blaine and then we'll go to Audrey.
Principle is truth. And there's greater principles. There's first principles. So there's principles that would apply to. Well, a principle is going to apply to anybody, anytime, anywhere, any. Yeah, I said anytime, right? So you could live 5,000 years ago, and it's still going to apply to them and to us. But there's the first principles. So there's a hierarchy of principles. So some will trump. One of those be if God says something, you do it. It doesn't matter what else is. If you know God is saying it, then you follow that principle, right?
Like Nephi.
Yeah. And so there's that. But then there's secondary principles or specific principles in all areas of life. And once we find that truth or that law or that principle, I think that those are interchangeable, then we get the results we want. And people will say, I've had people say, well, I've lived all the principles, I haven't got the results. I say, let's go to town. I promise you, you might be living one, but you're not living all these. I remember one lady said, I'm living all the health principles, and they don't work. I said, well, what's going on? And she told me, I get on the treadmill every day for 45 minutes. I can't lose weight. Well, when we looked at her diet, and we found out that when she's on the treadmill, she has backless tennis shoes. Now, I don't know how fast you can run if you have backless flip-flops on.
No way.
She wasn't running. She was walking very slowly. And so, obviously, you've got to live all the principles in that area. Not perfectly, but pretty dang good. And the longer you live them, the more confidence you have in them, the more confidence you have as a person. So that's a long answer, but that's kind of how I feel about the principles and how and the definition of them.
Well, thank you.
You're
Appreciate
welcome.
That. And your definition? Miss Principle?
Miss Succinct Principle. She'll say it a lot shorter than I did.
So the way that I usually teach it is that it's a foundational idea that can be acted upon. So it has to be, I have to be able to do something with it. I have to be able to look at that and say forgiveness, or let's say, and a really great way to learn about this is Bednar's book. You know what I'm talking about?
Yes, Increasive Learning.
Yes,
That's my favorite.
Increasive Learning, yes. And so the founding, well, not just the founders, but previous generations, and when you go further back in the books, you find this concept of natural law, the law of human nature, that human beings are so different than the other creatures on the planet that they have a law that applies specifically to them. And if you want the very best tutorial on this that was ever written, it's the first 5 chapters of Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis.
Amen.
And he will explain what that means and why it matters so much. And basically he makes the case that there is a law of human nature, that we all know it intuitively, and that we break it, and that's where the trouble comes. Because we know that we have done something contrary to this law, and we have to try to fix it somehow, so we blame.
Or we take responsibility. Those are the 2 options. But if we don't take responsibility, we'll start blaming someone. They
So
maybe do
this,
it, right?
Yeah, so there's this overarching law of human nature, and within that, the way that they would talk about it is first principles, things that are so intuitive that you don't even have to have an argument about it with anybody, that you can't be 2 places at once. So intuitive, it's just a first principle.
That
and
you
the
can't
way that
still.
the way that Elder
things.
Bednar talks about that is doctrine. So he's putting it in a spiritual context, that there's doctrine, or the founders would say first principles. And from those first principles or doctrine flow fundamental ideas upon which you can act. So a good example in the gospel would be, we would say your body is a temple. That's doctrine. But until you pull some principles from that concept, from that doctrine, it's hard for you to know what then would I do? How would I live this doctrine that the body is a temple? So you pull principles from that. Well, what are some principles? That you should dress modestly. That you should only take things into your body that are good for it. That you should save yourself until you're married. There are several, not a lot, maybe a dozen if I thought about it for a little while, but there would be some principles that flow from one first principle or doctrine that's a very simple thing. And then you can do something. Oh, modest, I can do something about that. You're going to do it in your way. We're going to look very different, but we could both be modest. Thus, in line with principle, thus in line with doctrine and natural law,
So
thus in line
thousands
with
of
God.
applications.
Yes, thus in line
Yeah.
with God. So there's limitless applications to whatever principle.
You might like rowboating, and I like running, or I like swimming. But
Yeah.
we're going
But
to
it's
exercise
still-
to take care of our bodies.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's just a very simplified idea of what I would say a principle is and how it flows in the big picture of things. So that's, God gave us the ability to learn. And this is what's interesting, is that we can always be in line with Him by obeying our consciences. Like if we were perfectly obedient to our consciences, we would be perfectly in congruence with the Lord's will, right?
Yeah.
But He gives us the ability to learn, thus to be able to find and discover principles and live them. And as, it's one of the reasons why, the Enlightenment happened, because information started to be shared, and I mean, that's a whole other thing that I talk about, how artistic principles began to be shared when publication happened, and that's one of the reasons why the Renaissance happened, was because fundamental principles of art were shared among the artists started to publish.
And that's
their
why you had
ideas.
so many more great art, because it was being shared, and you could say, oh, that's the
So when
principle.
and the same is true. True principles about government were shared for several generations in America through the books that were brought over, through the Bible,
Scottish
through the
Enlightenment.
writings, the Scottish Enlightenment, all that kind of stuff. Thus, preparing a solid foundation for
the Constitution.
yeah. So,
Awesome.
and then you can apply it. I love in the beginning of Tocqueville's Democracy in America. Is one of my very favorite quotes about principles. He says, I'm writing this book to tell you, been over in America, found out all about them. I want to tell you all about them. Because I'm from France and we're a different, we're a different governmental form. So I want to tell you all about America, and I want to teach you its principles, basically, he says, so that we can learn to live their principles in a French way.
Yeah.
Basically the idea that we don't have to look like America to live the principles that America lives.
Awesome. Yeah, that's beautiful.
And that's why Bednar wrote the book, I'm sure, because the more we can be a principle-centered church, the more we'll stop judging each other and getting in each
absolutely.
other's face and
Yeah.
giving each other grief,
Well, I
Just
loved
leave
it
each
how he
other alone.
said, I went around to several different stakes and asked them all the same question.
Yes.
I asked them all, which one do you focus on, applications, doctrines, or principles? And they
Yes.
all said applications.
Applications, yes.
All of them.
And he said, why?
Crazy.
And they said, because it's easier.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
That's way easy.
Oh, yeah.
To
Go
use
to
your
church,
mind,
do your-
to really
Yeah.
think. I mean, it's hard work. It's probably,
Oh, yeah.
prayer, they say, is the hardest thing you can do. And what are you doing? You're thinking, right? And you're forming thoughts, and you're talking to deity, but also just thinking on your own and to problem solve.
Yeah.
Because like our son, that example we used earlier, we're told what to do.
Yeah,
This
yeah.
one you can do. And so now you got to use your mind on your own, and that's
Wait
tough
a
work.
minute. I was being told what to
Yes.
do this whole time.
It's
Yeah.
tough work.
Yeah, it is tough work.
But it's worth it.
Oh, absolutely.
To be notified of our newest YouTube videos, be sure to click the subscribe button here. Head over to our new website for the latest gifts and promotions. For more videos like this one, click this playlist here.